Hello, everyone. Today we will be discussing a so-called coup attempt happened July 15 in 2016 in Turkey. So I am Mustafa Kirişçi. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Lebanon Valley College. So we will be discussing together with Ibrahim Kocaman. So Ibrahim, would you like to introduce yourself before diving into the July 15?
Yes, Mustafa, absolutely. And welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Ibrahim Kocaman. I'm an assistant professor of security studies and international affairs at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida. And prior to my academic career, I used to work as an intelligence officer in Turkish Air Force. My latest appointment was at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium. And during the course of my about 15 years of service in the Turkish Air Force, if I need to highlight something, I worked as the military advisor. Actually, it's called executive officer as the Turkish Air Force commander during General Akın Öztürk's tenure as a Turkish Air Force commander. It is significant because he is, as we all know, blamed as to be the military leader of the coup. That's why I would like to highlight that from my experience.
All right. Well, thank you. So today what we're going to do is twofold. First, we're going to examine how academia actually handled this so-called coup attempt in July 15, 2016, and how they framed it as a coup and then why it is wrong. So we will first discuss that and then briefly talk about why the way they understand this incident is wrong. In the second part, we will be talking about why this is not a coup. So we will be focusing on before July 15 and during the incident and after July 15. So we will be providing some evidence regarding this incident in a way that we will show why this cannot be a coup, and we will be providing a significant number of evidences so people can better understand why the narrative in academia as well as the narrative by government is wrong, and why the evidence shows that this is not a coup, but actually it's more like the failed intelligence operation that was aiming to purge the massive number of bureaucrats in Turkey. So let me first start with how academia discussed this. So after this incident happened in 2016, there were some articles in Turkey and outside of Turkey. So when we look at the articles, usually the outside sources, like usually the Western sources, framed it mostly like as a coup attempt. However, there were a lot of suspicions about why this happened and how this actually happened. But when we look at the Turkish articles, Turkish sources, they immediately adopted the Turkish government's rhetoric, which is that this incident is a coup. And then when we look at the evidences they provided, they simply argued that the Jamaat and the government has significant tension, and eventually the Jamaat resorted to this way of handling their issues with the government. But it is a very very narrow understanding of what actually happened in July 15 in 2016. Rather than understanding this as a coup, maybe it will be better to understand it as a purge, as a way to develop, a kind of intelligence operation that was aiming to purge a massive number of bureaucrats. So, so based on that, with this being said, so we were going to challenge to the existing narrative, the established narrative in the Turkish academia in regard to this incident, and we're going to start providing evidence from this incident before July 15, during the July 15, and after July 15. So, Ibrahim, would you like to start with some of the evidence, talking about some of the evidences that is available to everyone, publicly available information before July 15? And then why do you think this is not a coup, based on what we have seen in the coup literature, in academic coup literature?
That's great, Mustafa. But before delving into that, can I add a couple points to your general assessment about how academia addressed this point? I think, considering some of our audience may not be studying coups in an academic manner, maybe we can just briefly give a definition of a coup from Powell and Tynes data. That's Clayton Tyne and Jonathan Powell's coup data set, as you very well know, is by far the most standard data source. And they define coups as illegal and overt attempts by the military or other elites within the state apparatus to unseat the sitting executive. Since we're focusing on military coups, we can redefine for the 15 July case, it needs to be an illegal and overt attempt by the military to unseat the sitting executive. So as you rightly pointed out, both the domestic academia in Turkey and international scholars, we don't really agree with how they addressed the 15 July case. I mean, the domestic academia has a lot of reasons. They probably maybe fear of repression from Turkish regime. But I think one of the problems in how the international scholars and Turkish scholars based abroad failed to address this case properly is because of the available data sources. I mean, as you know, most of these coup data sources sets do resort to news agencies like Reuters, Agence Presse, or Associated Press, or, I mean, all of these internationally respected data sources do take their actual news sources from states. I mean, Turkey has another agency, and it's controlled by the state. So they, in effect, what these data sources report is basically just a briefly refined version of the Turkish regime's narrative. So I think that's the lack of comprehensive, unbiased, and credible data is one of the reasons why even the international independent scholarship has not properly addressed the 15 July case. Turning to your question, your question was like, how did it look like before the 15 July?
Yeah, what was the environment before July 2016, and what are those conditions actually that were not conducive to a military coup? So in the literature, we know that there are several factors that may encourage a military to stage a coup, but we believe that these conditions were missing. So what are those conditions you would like to talk about?
Yeah, maybe we should start by saying that coups are not isolated events. They do not occur out of nowhere. They do not occur in a vacuum. They do occur as a consequence of the ongoing political, social, economic conditions. So usually, and this is especially true for the Turkey, unfortunately, is a country which has a rich history of coups. And when we especially look at the Turkish coups, none of them are isolated events. They usually do occur because of certain political and social developments. Usually in Turkey, this is true for most of the coups, since coups are, as we just revisited the definition, are illegal events, because coups, in essence, are targeting democratically elected. It doesn't have to be. There are coups in autocracies, but as we're talking about democracies, they aim to unseat elected executives, so they are illegal by definition. So it's costly to carry out a coup. That is why usually military seizes an opportunity. It could be domestic instability. It could be economic downturn, poor economic performance. It could be grave human rights violations. Or in most cases, it is usually an unpopular government. When you look at the previous Turkish coup attempts and successful coups, the military usually almost waited until it was invited to carry out the coup by the societal actors like the civil society. I mean, this is emblematic when I say this for the Turkish audience. This was a thing in the 2007 crisis in Turkey, which was the first ever time the AKP tried to have their candidate Abdullah Gül elected as the president. There was this widespread protests. They're called the Republican protests. I'm translating the literal translation to English. And the people used to have pancarts saying "Army to the mission," like "Ordu göreve" is the Turkish. That's the mindset. I mean, the military usually waits until they are invited or they are lured into carrying out a coup by either political parties, members, actors in the social society. When you look at, for example, I don't think we have so much time to discuss each and every other coup incident in Turkey, but when you even look at 1960 coup, the first successful coup of the Republican era, Adnan Menderes was actually widely unpopular. I mean, although just briefly, just a little more than 2 years ago, his and his Democrat Party won 50-something percent, 58% of the vote. He was increasingly repressive. He was increasingly unpopular among the society, and economy was doing really, really bad. So when you compare this, I mean, in 1980, there was a crisis, and the parliament was unable to elect a new president. It was almost 6 months, and they were unable to elect a new president. In 1971, there was ongoing protests, widespread instability. In 1997, there was ongoing a high level of terrorism activity and a civil unrest in the society due to an Islamist government of Erbakan. And in all of these cases, when you look at those, there were some opportunities, I should say. There were some political, social conditions and instability that military can use as a pretext to carry out a coup. But when you look at the July 2016 coup attempt, as you might remember, just about 6 months or so, maybe 7-8 months or so, in November 2015, the AKP's government was elected with 49% of the vote, with Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, who was interestingly asked to leave his position, suspiciously enough, only 2 months before the coup attempt. So when you look at the conditions in the run-up of July 2016, there was a very popular government. Economy was relatively doing good. Turkish military carried out a lot of counter-terror operations at the expense of bulldozing some cities in the southeast. I mean, terrorist activities of PKK was somewhat suppressed, so there was not really a big problem of terrorism or instability. And Turkey was doing just about okay in international relations. So there was not really any actual opportunities that military could seize upon to carry out a coup. So there was, I would say, a coup attempt was really uncalled for. I mean, make no mistake, every coup action is uncalled for in a democracy, but sometimes military uses those opportunities for the perception that a coup was called for. This was not the case before July 2016.
Yeah, so there were, I mean, we don't necessarily deny that there were already some grievances from many sides after the corruption scandal in late 2013.
Yes.
Yeah, there were a lot of human rights violations, but all these violations, like none of them actually invited military to stage a coup. There were some rumors about that, but when you look at the actual conditions, like in terms of economy, societal demand for coup, the popular support, for example. So usually all the coups, not just the previous coups in Turkey, but also when you look at the coups in like many other countries, first you need a very, very unpopular government. I'm not talking about like the unpopular government in Turkey currently. I'm talking about, like, for example, the Maduro in Venezuela, which only has 20% of the popular support, right? Other than that, economy. So yes, the economy wasn't like the economy before 2013. Yes, economy was not going in a good direction, in the right direction. However, the economy in 2016 wasn't like the economy today in Turkey.
Yeah, it was much better.
It was much better, right? So, right now, given that the economy was going well, so why would a military actually stage a coup in such an environment? Because at the end of the day, militaries need legitimacy. Because when they stage a coup and when they seize the power, they need to make sure that the society is going to support them. And that's what we saw in the previous coups. So why would a military actually stage a coup in such an environment where they will risk losing a lot of popular support when they stage a coup, right? So given that, so now we know that why the conditions were not really conducive before July 15. And then that's exactly what Jonathan Powell, who is a famous coup scholar, indicated, that this coup is, this quote-unquote coup is very weird because of these types of pre-existing, these types of conditions before July 15. So now let's talk about what happened on July 15, and then why there were a lot of irregularities on July 15, and then how we can actually talk about these irregularities in the sense that why they can become a reason to reject the existing narrative in academia, also the narrative by government that this is a coup. So what are the evidences we can bring from during the coup, so we can say that this is not a coup? This is actually intelligence operations that that is aiming to purge a lot of people.
Okay, that's a good point. I think we can list several different number of indicators showing, I mean, during what unfolded after the coup supposedly started at the night of July 15. That was a Friday night. I think we can definitely visit several topics here. One is the lack of a plan. I'll first give the titles and then dive a little deeper. There was not a plan. We'll talk about later. There was not a clear leader, and I will talk about. We can talk about General Akın Öztürk's case, who was blamed to be the leader of this coup, and we can talk about the execution. This and timing. Timing was really bad, not just because, as we discussed, the general conditions, social and political conditions in Turkey was not really conducive to result in a coup. Not just the broader timing, but also the timing of the day, as it's, I mean, the first ever message from the Turkish General Staff was broadcast in 15 minutes past 10 p.m. on a Friday night, and the first ever actions on the ground, the tanks that they occupied one lane, one direction on the Bosphorus Bridge was around 9:30. So 9:30 p.m. on a Friday night on a really hot July day in Turkey is not really a good time for a coup. We'll talk about the timing and execution, why the ill execution was really bad, and I will actually argue, based on the definition of a coup, that there was not really a clear targeting of the executive. The evidence showing that the executive was actually targeted is very limited. But maybe we can start by the first point, like the plan. I mean, coups are complex. We don't like them, obviously. There's no way that we can support any coup, but coups are, in essence, just another military operation. So you need, and it's a complex military operation. And allegedly, in the 15 July case, there were events and activities on the ground in multiple locations, multiple cities: Ankara, the capital, Istanbul, Marmaris, and in Mersin, southern Turkey, and some naval operations. Some ships were sailing. And there were some activities in Gölcük, arguably by the Turkish Navy. So ground forces, Air Force, there were some aircraft flying, Navy. So like this is, if we take it as a face value that this was indeed an actual planned military operation, this requires a lot of coordination and a very exact plan, because this seems to be a joint military operation. Again, if we take the argument that this was indeed a coup activity, as someone who planned air operations and who participated planning of joint military operations, you need a plan. And there is, to this day, it's almost 9 years now, and the courts or the regime has not been able to show us a planning document. If I were to give an example, for the 1980 coup, the name of the plan was flag operation plan. So it's Bayrak operation plan in Turkey. Flag meaning the Turkish flag. So Kenan Evren actually tasked his deputy, Haydar Saltık, General Haydar Saltık, to lead a plan and to come up with a plan, and they had a name for the plan. It was the Flag Operation Plan. So first of all, it's been 9 years, and the courts and the public prosecutors have yet to show us a planning document. I'm not just talking about the written document. There are no recorded phone calls, intercepted phone calls, or electronic intelligence, signals intelligence, showing that indeed the suspects, the defendants, were in a planning activity before the coup. So there are no actual evidence of a plan or planning activity. So that's the first thing. The second thing is coups need leaders, and there is no clear leader here. I mean, you might say, how about Akın Öztürk, the 4-star general who was the former Turkish Air Force commander, who is charged by the prosecutor's office as being the military leader of the coup. Then I will just remind the recent ruling by the UN, United Nations Human Rights Council, actually their working group on arbitrary detentions, but that working group issues rulings on behalf of UN Human Rights Council and the UN. And basically, I mean, I spoke to another broadcast, and there has been multiple broadcasts in this channel about that ruling. So we're not going to go into the details of that ruling, but basically that ruling established that Akın Öztürk was mistried, and he cannot be the leader of the coup. If there's no leader, and based on all the other events that we have been discussing, this is not a coup. This is then something else, right?
Yeah, even if we argue, even if someone, I mean, I think this point, the leadership point, is not really being like even the people who are supporting the regime's rhetoric. So they don't even buy into this idea that Akın Öztürk was the leader. Even like the Turkish military's website, in the first, I don't know, maybe a few hours, they said, they didn't accept the idea that Akın Öztürk was the head of the coup. Eventually, they changed it. They removed that. They removed the content from the website. But some people, especially the opposition figures, they believe that Hulusi Akar could be the leader. But I think a coup leader, like you described, should give orders. I think the way, how he acted on the coup day wasn't really fitting to a coup leader.
Yeah,
on
exactly.
July 15. Because what Hulusi Akar was kind of trying to carry out a plan that was developed by either government or maybe intelligence agency in order to bring more soldiers to trap the government actually set before July 15. So Hulusi Akar wasn't actually acting like a traditional coup leader.
But I think he acted like a pseudo coup leader. Like he acted in a way that the military people would believe that he was actually leading the coup, but at the same time he was in coordination with the political elites, like the prime minister, maybe not prime minister, but the president and chief of intelligence. Don't forget, Hakan Fidan is a very important actor here. So he actually coordinated that relationship, and he, due to his unique position, since he had the ability to give orders to the whole military, don't forget, he was the one who who shut down the Turkish airspace early, even before the coup activity started. It was actually 7 p.m. that he shut down the Turkish airspace, because he has the right to do so. So when he did that, the military people who are subordinate to him just thought that he was actually acting in support of them. But at the end of the night and in the morning, it turned out that he was actually acting on behalf of the government. Exactly. I think his role was really instrumental in trapping the innocent, the military people, especially mid-level officers and junior officers who have no idea.
And speaking to those officers, so a lot of them actually were told that they are going to counterterrorism operations. So why would a coup leader actually, if you were a coup leader, so why would you allow your soldiers to be in the streets for a counterterrorism operation. You can simply say that, yeah, you will be in those other streets because we are trying to overthrow government. So you don't need actually an excuse for your soldiers to be in the street because you are the top general. So if you just give the order, then everyone will be in the street to overthrow the government. But why would you need such an excuse or pretext of like counterterrorism operation? So even that.
Can I tell you why? Can I tell you why?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, think about the Bosphorus, the small tank unit that occupied one direction of the Bosphorus bridge. So they were asked to go to that bridge block the bridge starting 9:30 p.m. So if you told them that we are carrying out the coup and your duty is just to block the one way, not even two ways of the traffic in Istanbul, only one of the bridges, by the way, in Bosphorus bridge, they would maybe not buy it. Like, why are we? Because blocking a bridge has nothing to do, is not supposed to add anything of military value to the cooperation. But it makes a lot of sense if you tell them we are doing a counter-terror operation. There's a suspected ISIS attack, and we're trying to stop traffic coming from the Anatolian side of Istanbul to the European side. That would make sense. I can go on in terms of the timing, not just. You wouldn't start the coup at 9:30 p.m. You wouldn't do some of the stuffs that these coup plotters were arguably doing. It was really there was really ill execution. Like I mentioned before, there are multiple events in multiple cities: Ankara, Istanbul, Marmaris, and naval operations. They don't seem to be coordinated. Coups need coordinated events. It's a complex, coordinated activity. I can only maybe give like one example about that. Remember when the Marmaris team, allegedly who's tasked to capture Erdogan, arrives in Marmaris, the hotel that he was staying. The team led by General Gökhan Şahin Sönmez Ateş, whom, by the way, I know and I work with in some of my time in the military, him and his team arrives in the hotel at 20 minutes past 3 a.m. So 3:20 a.m. At that time, all the public already know that Erdogan is in Istanbul, and he has given more than an hour ago, maybe an hour or 2 hours ago, he gave public broadcast appearance in Atatürk Airport. He even said that this coup attempt was a gift from God. And think about this: these are either so bad coupists that are not even able to coordinate. So the coup leaders, the alleged coup leaders in Ankara are not even able to tell Gökhan Şahin Sönmez Ateş that Erdogan is not in Marmaris anymore.
Yeah.
So he's there just in vain. Him and his team is sent to Marmaris, I would say, by Hulusi Akar, just to give the impression that someone was trying to target the executive. That's why I say that in July 15 incident, the executive wasn't really targeted. There's not really credible targeting of the executive, because this is what happened in Marmaris. When the team arrived, Erdogan has left more than 2 hours ago. We can verify this by his first ever, but not broadcast, statement to the local press in Marmaris. And the fact that he was in Istanbul almost 2 hours before the Marmaris team arrived there. And the second most likely attempt on the executive, the alleged attack to the Prime Minister, Binali Yildirim. Remember, there was a Prime Minister's office in Turkey. Binali Yildirim was the Prime Minister, and he is argued by the prosecution that he was only saved from the attack just because he took refuge at the highway tunnel, right? But we don't see these incidents highlighted in the courts or even in the media. By the way, 90 to 95% of the media is controlled by the Turkish regime. So why would you not highlight the two most likely events that would actually prove that this is indeed a coup attempt? And remember what Binali Yildirim said when he was asked about his least favorite event during his premiership. He said his least favorite event was the 15 July project. I think that language kind of tells something. I think his subconscious comes out and he says project, right?
Yeah, maybe because he talked to Erdogan about this. And
I mean, why would you call that as a project if it's an attempt by someone else on your life?
Yeah, that's my main question. I mean, why would coup plotters actually try to kill a prime minister? Like, in how many instances of coups, like in what percentages of the coups that military actually literally killed?
It wouldn't help you, right? If you kill a prime minister whose party just received 49% of the vote, in anything that would make you the enemy of the people. Remember, the military didn't directly kill. The military didn't kill Adnan Menderes. They captured him, they jailed him, and he was eventually tried, and he was life sent. Capital punishment was decided by the court, which I obviously don't agree that he should be hanged, and anyone who supports democracy or human rights should not. But the military didn't kill him. Like you said, that's a good point. Military never tried to kill any of the executive. I mean, military was actually in very respectful against not just the prime ministers. They captured Celal Bayar. They captured the prime minister in 1980 coup, Demirel, and other party leaders. And we can tell this. Not just the prime minister or the president. No political figures. Can you name me any political figure that was actually detained or captured that night?
I don't remember from other countries too. I mean, the whole point behind the coup is that these government guys are bad, they are corrupt, they are not legitimate. Yeah. And we are legitimate, we are the guardian of the regime. So now we're going to remove these people from the regime. But this idea doesn't necessarily include that we're going to kill them, because the killing is usually not part of it. There might be killing. Well, there are some, there's some literature talking about, blood coups.
Bloody coups, yeah.
But that usually happens when they react, when they see some reaction. Even in 1960 coup, there were some reactions, but we didn't see much, really significant number of killings, right? So I think even this idea that killing prime minister doesn't really make sense for traditional coups.
That would make you the enemy of the enemy.
Now, if you want, we can now talk about after, what happened immediately after and after July 15. Like, for example, we can talk about, why would a government that faced a coup immediately try to purge thousands of judges and also teachers, other bureaucrats? And this happened maybe even during the incident, I'm not talking about July 17 or July 16. We talk about literally, actually July 16, not July 17 or 18. So one day after, maybe hours after, they started purging people as if they're already prepared to do so. So, and I think this is one of the main evidence. You can talk more about that. And then we can talk other types of evidence that in the post July 15, other types of evidence that would show us that this is definitely not a coup.
I want to tell a small story here. Actually a memory here. So as I mentioned, I was working at the NATO headquarters as a military representative on behalf of Turkish military. And the Monday after the July 15 coup attempt. So July 15 incident was a Friday. So that Monday, July 18th, I was going to the cafeteria. We had this shared cafeteria where all people, all officers and civilian people serving at the headquarters, including from all nations, have their lunches. So I was going for lunch, and I just happened to come across an American colonel, Navy colonel. So this is an external observer. Okay, I may have ties to the people who are blamed to be involved in the coup, right? First and foremost, I can assume. But this person, American Navy captain, highly experienced, and has no ties to Turkey at all. And he sees this small news about Turkey's action of firing 2,700 judges, and he's able to tell, a normal government wouldn't just fire judges in response to a coup. So this this seems like something else. He told me, I don't believe that this is a coup. Someone external to Turkey was able to tell, but has military experience, able to tell. So I want to bring this up as, would firing a huge number of judges be your first action responding to a coup? No. And he said he was able to tell because this requires a lot of time to prepare a list of 2,700 judges. And he said it means that they took a lot of time preparing these lists, and they were prepared to do what they did. Because would that be your first ever worry if you're attacked as the government by a military coup? Would you spend time putting together a list of 2,700 judges? How long would that take?
So we can actually refer to, for example, let's say this is they argue this is a failed coup. So let's give an example, like a failed coup example in Spain in 1981, I think.
81, yes, I was going to bring that up. Yeah,
well,
go ahead.
I don't remember anything about like arresting judges, arresting teachers. Like, I mean, the first thing you need to do is to who did it in the military. What is it? Who, what faction actually did this or attempted to do that? And then you try to basically, arrest them or punish them. There might be some indiscriminate number of arrests. Like you may think that maybe these groups also supported them, but usually you need to focus on the military because that's the actual actor, right? But the judges are like completely outsiders, and there's no evidence that they actually like were involved in it. But the first action you need to do is to start, purging judges, but not just purging judges. I'm talking about 2,700 judges.
Yeah.
So I think there's a significant effort, like you mentioned, there's a significant effort that was laid out before the coup, and then they determined like these 2,700 judges, and then they did the first thing after the coup, and then there's important evidence that as a post-coup development, that showing that this is not necessarily a coup. This is something that they use this as an excuse to do what they are planning to do, which is the state of emergency and purging massive number of bureaucrats.
So I was going to bring that up. It's good that you brought the Spanish 1981 coup attempt. I mean, what would normally, let's say Turkey, let's focus on the assumption that Turkey was a democracy back then. I mean, there were troubles with Turkey's democratization, but what would a normally democratically elected, in quotations, government do in response of a coup? So coups are the ultimate sin in democracies. You would use this as a window of opportunity, I mean, to become a more like the proponents of a democracy as the regime. Now that you survive a coup attempt to your democracy as a democratically elected government, you would use this as an opportunity to further democratize, to become recognized as the surviving democratic regime, a regime that defeated a coup. And that would boost your popular support, not just popular support domestically, but also from your international allies, partners. And in the coup literature, we have a lot of international reactions to coup. It's an important thing, how international actors, your allies, your trade partners. So you are set to garner some more sympathy, some more positive feelings from all of your domestic and international counterparts, right? Your stakeholders. That's what the Spanish government did after 1981 coup. They further democratized. That's what happened in the failed coup attempts of 1975 in Portugal. Both of these countries, I'm bringing up Portugal and Spain because they're somewhat comparable to Turkey because they are NATO members. They are, democracies, but not at the time of the coups happened. They're not really fully established democracies. But guess what happened? Look at them right now. They used these failed coup attempts to become better democracies, to increase the legitimacy of their government. And now compare that to what Erdogan regime did. Not just purging the judges, not just purging the military officers who have nothing to do with the coup, including military cadets in service academies and even service high schools, even military high school cadets. Teachers, preschool teachers, municipality workers, just just normal citizens who were just going about their lives were purged from public service if they're a public servant, and I mean, academics, right? Erdogan just used this coup attempt as a pretext to carry out a far-reaching, I mean, the countrywide purges across all layers of the social and political spectrum. It doesn't fit to the actions of a normal democratic elected government in responding a coup, right?
Yeah. So it's actually like over an hour.
Yeah.
So like if you wrap up, so basically what we have discussed today, there's a significant problem with the narrative and the arguments developed by the Turkish academia regarding this incident, because they simply relied on the government rhetoric, and then a lot of the assumptions they develop are post hoc. Like, for example, the Gülenists, they had problems with the Turkish government in terms of, the dershanes, like, like private tutor schools or something like that, and like their like corruption scandal, for example. So and then they simply resorted to this coup because of all these tensions. But we know that the government had a lot of problems with many other groups, but they don't necessarily resort to coups, right?
Yeah.
So I think we can actually like invite all academics in Turkey, because we believe that, the regular citizens may not really know all the details, may not be able to know all the details because of the the heavily controlled media. But we assume that academics, so they are more enlightened people, more educated people. So we need to challenge the government's rhetoric in investigating, in doing our research. So if you simply like believe in what government is saying, like currently today, Ekrem İmamoğlu actually has done significant corruption. So if you're okay with like believing that, then you can actually believe that July 15 was a coup.
Exactly.
So if you actually are not okay with the government's rhetoric, and if you don't want to believe in what they actually are saying in everything, then we need to challenge this argument. And we need to challenge this argument by providing evidence. So we today we provide a lot of evidence from pre-July 15, during July 15 incident, and after July 15 incident. So the evidence shows that this doesn't really necessarily, this doesn't fit, never fits to a traditional coup. And when you look at the coups, for example, the data set on coups from 1950 to 1950 to 2010, and even like the later coups, there's no coup that would fit, that would actually include incidents that we actually discussed. For example, the bridge, Bosphorus Bridge, Marmaris events, firing 2,700 judges, for example. So none of these or trying to kill the prime minister, for instance. So a lot of the evidences in the coups show that coup requires coordination. Coup doesn't really require killing people. Coup doesn't require, for example, bombing a parliament. We didn't even discuss that, and that's the other point too. So a lot of the evidence shows that this is not a coup. But we invite academics from Western scholars and Turkish scholars too to better investigate this case by looking into the actual evidence from court cases, for example, rather than simply relying on the government's rhetoric. Because if you believe in government rhetoric, then you should believe that Ekrem İmamoğlu has done extensive corruption, and you should also believe that a lot of the Erdogan's opposition figures are really bad people. They're the enemy of the people. They involve in terrorist actions. So if you are okay with believing all these lies, then it is normal that you can actually believe that this is a coup. So I would also argue that there are some articles I remember from like Western scholars too. For example, one of them was published in a very well-known journal, like Journal of Conflict Resolution. So they were trying to understand how military academies, the number of military academies can affect the chances of coups. And then they gave this example because the cadets were involved in it. So the fact that cadets were involved doesn't necessarily mean that military academies will increase the chances of coups.
Exactly.
Yes, in the 1960s, there was such a case. The academies were involved. But in here, a lot of the cadets were shown as involved because they were told that there's a terrorist activity, terrorist threat. None of them actually was aware of this issue, this July 15 like coup attempt or something like that. So I think Western scholars and Turkish scholars, they should focus on the evidence rather than the government rhetoric. So if we just believe in the government rhetoric, that will distort our data collection, that will distort our theories, argumentation, and that eventually will introduce biases into our studies, and eventually will make our studies unreliable. So thank you for, like talking about all these evidences like in detail, also like sharing some like interesting stories about that. So hopefully in the future years, from this point on, we will see more thorough studies that provide actual evidences, not simply relying on the narratives from the government.
Yeah,
So if
you
you have
wrote some.
something to say before closing it, so yeah, you can talk about that.
Yeah, you wrote a really great summary of how the academia should address this. Maybe I can just add a few wrapping up comments to that. I think, as you mentioned, there are like two big mistakes the academia should avoid and hasn't been doing so far. One is, assessing the July 15 coup attempt in isolation. It was not an isolated incident. It happened in the broad context background of social and military activities, the political and social developments. One is that, and the other one is actually starting the analysis with that night, and not actually looking at what was happening before that event. I mean, if I can just give the last year's examples, before the November 2015 elections, there was this Ankara train station attack, which killed most of the Kurdish political party supporters. There was a wave of ongoing terror incidents. In February 2016, there was this military buses attack in the heart of Ankara, which killed about 28 people, including some military and civilian people. And there was this Istanbul airport attack, catch this, only 2 weeks before the July 15 incident, just late days, 29th or 30th of June 2016. So the military and the public was actually framed into this terror attack mindset. So when these junior and mid-level military officers were called upon duty to respond to the terror incident, it was very much expected for them. They weren't suspicious. So we have to understand what made these people go ahead and seemingly participate in the coup, because they were believing that they were actually responding to a terror incident. I think that's a great point. To wrap up, like you said, this incident has huge discrepancies with the previous coup attempts in Turkey, and it doesn't fit to the broader literature. As you said, we're calling to the academics who are interested in this incident and the broader civil military relations scholarship to really look at the facts and evidence on both sides, and not just the government narrative in analyzing this incident. Today, we tried to really bring up some important evidence that we think could help us better understand and to make sense of the July 15 incident in Turkey. Thank you so much, Mustafa. It was a very fruitful discussion. I believe that.
Well, thank you very much for listening to us. So far for now. So now we concluded that this is not a coup. Then what is it? So how can we define this? So hopefully next time,
maybe
talk about how we can categorize this based on the literature. So hopefully next time we're going to talk about how we can define this, how we can categorize this incident. If it is not a coup, so what is it? So hopefully next time. So stay tuned. We're going to talk about how we can categorize this based on the evidence, based on the literature. So once again, thank you very much. Hopefully next time we'll see you soon, and then we're going to talk about how we can understand this case, how we can categorize this case. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mustafa.